Welcome back to the program. The next few episodes are going to be very important if you work. I mean, like, if you have a job. Anyone who's a millennial, Gen Alpha, or whatever, basically anyone Gen X or after is going to learn a lot. And if you already know it, like especially some Gen Xers might, it's still going to be important to review and remember. Again, this isn't just about government workers. You'll see why if you stick with me, but trust me, if you can't afford a house, a car, or if you just can't seem to catch a break in this economy that's supposedly doing great, then listen up. I know no one is probably going to listen to this. I'm not naive or self-righteous enough to believe that I've got the best podcast on the internet, but I really do want this information out there in a digestible way to real people. A lot of political podcasts talk about Senator Joe Schmo did this and then Jane Marie did that. That's all important, but it isn't really all that helpful, and I think that can seem like gatekeeping, and I think it can actually be a big part of the problem as to why more people aren't engaged with the system. Before we get started though, I want to ask for your help. There's a lot of maddening information in this episode, and I need your help to spread it around. Please follow Doge Uncovered on X, TikTok, Blue Sky. Look us up on YouTube. Share the podcast links on Instagram and Facebook for me. Actually, share them everywhere. If anyone wants to render assistance, you can reach out. There's information at the end of the episode. It's Doge Uncovered, and this is the program for anyone, regardless of political persuasion, who just wants to hear what is going on inside the government from people who actually work there. There's a lot of manufactured division in the country, and my goal is to help dismantle that division by giving folks a look under the hood of their government and showing them why it matters to them. On the first episode, we learned about the various departments in the federal government and how much it costs to employ the people who work there. We learned that the cost of insuring people through Medicare and the cost of paying interest on the national debt is about the same. Both cost about 14% of the federal budget. We learned that the federal salaries are about 5% of the federal budget. As I design this second episode, I'm realizing that I have a lot of stuff to get to that expands on the first episode, but I also promised to look into Trump's favorite president, but I'm probably not going to make it to that today. If you work for a living, like I said, if you get a paycheck, these next few episodes are going to be very important. This podcast isn't just for federal workers. They mostly already know this stuff. What I'm trying to do here is get information out to people who don't really know what to make of what they hear because they don't know how government works. Actually works. And it's okay if you don't know how government works. That's why I'm here. I didn't know what was going on in government either when I started working in government. I never planned on this podcast covering a large amount of breaking news just because there are plenty of other places to get that information. And it seems like when you step into that world, even if your intention is to portray factual information, you are immediately branded as left or right. This podcast exists to give some perspective to that news and to give folks the ability to be able to interpret it. There is so much breaking news right now that if I put on all that stuff that is important and interesting, then we just have another breaking news podcast. But sometimes there will be things that happen that are important to the discussion we're currently having, and that will cause me to deviate from what I planned on talking about. And in this case, there is something going on that is going to require me to explain something called a riff, because government firings are in the news a lot lately, so William McKinley is going to have to wait for another day. All right, let's get started here. There's a new private club opening up in Washington, D.C. Several investors, including Donald Trump Jr. and mega donor Ahmed Malik, are launching it. It is invite only, so you and I can't get in. That's okay, though, because the fee to join is $500,000. This is not a joke. This is not some sort of parable or allegory. There is a club being opened in Washington, D.C. by Donald Trump's son that is invite only and has a membership fee of $500,000. And the club is called the Executive Branch. So what do you get for $500,000? According to Politico, the club is there, quote, for business and tech moguls who are looking to nurture their relationships with the Trump administration, end quote. Again, the club is called the Executive Branch. It's crazy, like it's just absolutely nuts. So what does this mean for us working folks? I'm going to talk a lot right now about employee protections and how, being the largest workforce in the U.S., the treatment of federal workers trickles down to the treatment of other workers in the U.S. With that, we must also recognize that the federal government has typically been very deliberate. I had a history teacher in high school who explained that people like to complain about how the government is slow. He argued that this was actually by design. He said that we really shouldn't want our government to work quickly and make brash decisions. He said that the founding fathers spent a lot of time designing difficulty into the system that required compromise and patience. We seem to be losing the ability to practice patience and compromise at the governmental level, and this has led to some big problems that federal workers can see. When I first started working in the federal government, the policies and procedures didn't make any sense to me, like at all. It seemed like we were just doing things in a way that made them complicated. Someone would tell me how something worked or how he did something, and I'd ask how they knew that was how he did it. They usually said something like, oh, it's going to be in a policy document somewhere, or you can ask so-and-so, but it's just how we do it. As an outsider, it just seemed like I could come up with better ways of doing these things. It was a little shocking to see a large group of people seemingly going along with a bunch of convoluted procedures that just didn't make any sense. It was like living in an alternative reality to what I was used to. Over time, though, many of those policies and procedures that initially seemed goofy end up becoming more clear. And there are still those that don't make sense. And if you ask your coworkers and they can't explain the ones that don't make sense, and they don't understand it either, then you've probably found something that warrants a first look to see if it's still valid, where it came from, and who put it there. Right now, the government is planning large-scale reductions in force, or RIFs, R-A-F, I know, another government acronym, and it's carrying out what essentially amounts to forced retirements. Much of this institutional knowledge will be gone, but there is something worse happening with these RIFs, and that is that much of it seems to be intentional destruction of systems. And if you thought I was going to say, this is by design, you'd be right. It is by design, because government employees, especially those who have been through RIF procedures as outlined in statutes, and that's very important, see something completely different happening now. And the federal government is not a social media site. If your social media site breaks for an hour or a day, a week, like, who cares? It's just a social media site. But the government systems can't be broken without serious unforeseen consequences, especially if you are breaking something that you don't care to understand. All the personal data of Americans that seems to have been compromised is a different conversation. And if you haven't heard of that, I think at some point the government is going to have to issue all new social security numbers to Americans in what will amount to a New Deal era program to re-register Americans. Genuinely, it's absolutely batshit crazy how some of these systems and policies and procedures have been breached and systems compromised because of it. We can get to that later, but suffice it to say that a typical RIF has a specific protocol for how it gets done. First of all, it's typically done on an agency level. So let's say the Department of Defense decides that it may be too big. Again, remember that Congress sets the priority of the agencies of government. So the DoD decides that it is bigger than it needs to be to carry out their mission, or that Congress is not properly funding them, and they need to cut some people. They would then decide to spend a large amount of time, a year or more, looking into what services are required by statute, where there are services that are duplicative, where there are divisions or departments that can be combined, stuff like that. Remember, if you think about each department that we talked about in the first episode, don't think about it as part of the government. Think about it as like a separate micro government or a separate smaller government. And again, that's also by design. But anyway, the agency would develop a plan to RIF the employees that they need to downsize, basically lay them off. RIF notices would eventually be sent to employees, and they typically would get 60 days, sometimes as few as 30 days, to finish up their work and close out their stations. This is why government is slow. The RIF procedure outlines specific steps to take in order to make sure that things didn't fall apart. The amount of staffing reduction was set by a clear look at the overall condition of the agency, the amount of redundancy, the budget priorities, and the needs going forward. But when Trump came to power, he instituted a hiring freeze across the entire federal government, one that persists to this day and that wasn't based on budget issues. He also said really backwards things like, you can't create a new federal position unless you delete 4 positions, which, from an efficiency and efficacy viewpoint, is just dumbly arbitrary. Then, Musk's Doge tried to get any random federal employee that they could to resign. The reason they did this was because federal employees who resign give up a lot of rights. They give up rights to severance, rights to unemployment benefits, rights to appeal, rights to return to federal service, and a bunch of other stuff. But then they had to couch this by saying that they would need approval to resign under this made-up resignation program. And I call it made up because no one in government had ever heard of such a thing. It just did not exist in any policy or procedure. There was never a rumor of it. It was not in any statute. It was almost as if their disdain for federal employees got in the way of their ability to see that the federal government actually does stuff. But when this didn't net enough quittings for them, they started rolling out RIF programs. The VA, for example, wants to RIF 70 to 80,000 employees by July, a process that normally takes over a year. They're trying to do in under 5 months. The VA Secretary, Doug Collins, has said that this is a goal, except this is not how RIFs work. At least it's certainly not how logic works. Donald Rumsfeld summed this up best when he was talking about unknown knowns and known unknowns. There is no way that a new secretary can come into a system like the VA and just know that there are 80,000 too many people when compared to the mission and the programs of the agency. The number of RIFed employees is arrived at the end of the process, after you figure out what's broken, what's duplicated, what's short, what's no longer a mission, and all of that. And some agencies have already started RIFs and are needing to admit failure. At least failure is what I wish they would call it, because it's almost like it was designed to just all be privatized. At the Food and Drug Administration, they're planning to hire contractors to replace the duties of some federal employees who were terminated less than a month ago. The FDA finished deciding which positions were unnecessary in April, and they let those people go. Now they are seeking contractors to do the exact same jobs that the RIFed employees were doing, even saying they'll get government badges, government computers, and that there is an immediate need. The only difference, aside from probably the cost to government, which will certainly be more because they'll have to pay the well-connected middleman who manages the contractors, is that the positions can work remotely. Doe! Now, there was that doe sound from The Simpsons there because one of Donald Trump's first executive orders is that all government workers need to go back to an office. This is a whole nother mess we'll talk about later, but Donald Trump wanted all the workers in the office. Then they fired a bunch of workers, and they're hiring them back because these are specialized services. There's not like people in the public that just do a lot of the stuff that the FDA does. So they're definitely more than likely going to hire back people who already worked at the FDA as contractors who can now work from home. It doesn't make any sense because now the government's going to end up paying more to hire those people. Those people are going to end up getting paid less because now there's a middleman in there. So that's that. This next part is about wealth and inequality, because I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind, whether you make $30,000 a year or $300,000 a year, that we are all closer to that guy begging for change on the street than we are to the billionaires who have seats at the table of our government. Since 2012, shortly after the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, the amount of rich person money pouring into the federal elections has gone up astronomically. There are charts out there that you can find, so I'll spare you all the numbers because it's really depressing. But here's what we could do to kind of ground ourselves in reality. Let's say I have $1 billion. If I wanted to donate $1 million to a political campaign, I'd get an incredible amount of influence. Trump routinely holds $1 million plate dinners at Mar-a-Lago, where he and his administration hobnob with other billionaires. There was just one a couple weeks ago. So under my hypothetical here, I'd be a relatively poor billionaire, like I'd only have $1 billion. But under that hypothetical, I could donate $1 million 1,000 times before I ran out of money. In other words, a billionaire is a millionaire 1,000 times over. And someone with $10 billion is a millionaire 10,000 times over. The amount of influence that the ultra-rich peddle is astronomical. For comparison, a person making $30,000 a year could donate $30 1,000 times before they ran out of money that year. And a person making $300,000 a year, they could donate $300 1,000 times before they ran out. I know that this doesn't take into account all the things that we have to pay for and buy to live, and that actually helps illustrate the point. Even if we wanted to, there is no way our wallets would even make a squeak in politics if the wallets of the rich sound like air raid sirens. This illustrates how most of us can't even fathom the amount of money that the brigade of rich tycoons and tech bros have. And we should recognize that this is a two-way street. A lot of people are always like, oh, but the rich people are giving us jobs. That's not what the poor people of the world in any society on earth ever said to increase their station in life. Rich people have no idea what it's like to make decisions based on economics. What car can you afford? What grocery store will you shop at? Where will you live? You may be thinking, yeah, but most of those rich people were working out of a garage at some point or something. They can't all just be rich without knowing where they came from. That's true in some cases. A lot of rich people pledge to give their money away, but these typically aren't the people with a seat at government's table now, probably because they want nothing to do with the shit show that is the US government right now. And for the rest, the human condition is pliable and adaptable. There used to be a historic building down the street from my house. It was over 100 years old. They tore it down to build a bank on the site. I was sad and upset because it was wasteful, I felt, and short-sighted. But within a few months of the bank being open, I found myself forgetting what used to be on that site. I'd remind myself of the fact that there used to be something cool there, and in its place now is a disposable building. And this didn't just happen once, it happened several times down the street. This is how cities get rebuilt, and very quickly people forget what used to be. This adaptability is one of the things that makes humans so successful as a species. Once people start making a boatload of money, they can quickly forget what it was like to not have it. More importantly, though, they can forget that these things aren't possible for everyone. Even people who make $150,000 can forget what it was like when they made $50,000. This is evidenced by the talking points that come out of rich people's mouths. They say things like, poor people aren't poor because they're victims of a system. They're poor because they're lazy and they have no drive to change their condition. Then other people who are closer to those poor people than they are to the billionaires whose mouths initially uttered this, take up this ideology, and pretty soon the poor are pitted against the poor, and the poor are pitted against the lower middle class, and the lower middle class is pitted against the upper middle class, and these artificial divisions grow until everyone is in service to the billionaire class at the cost of their own welfare. I've always found it ironic that people who are poor and who do jobs like mine coal or work oil rigs say that poor people are poor because they're allergic to work. Clearly, their own lived experiences say otherwise, yet they've become so consumed with the rhetoric that they can be rich if they just keep working hard and keep doing what they're doing. Remember my story about the FDA? The reason those jobs were even brought back is probably because they affected some loud stakeholders, namely pharmaceutical companies. But other things are happening that don't have loud stakeholders. I have a friend who works in the trades, and prior to Trump's election, he randomly went on a tirade about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, also known as the CFPB. Like USAID, which we talked about in episode 1, this is a small agency with a massively outsized effect. It was a small dog with a big bite, and I had never thought about it as corrupt. I knew what it did. It wasn't even a thing that entered my mind that this is massive corruption. So I was willing to listen, especially if it was going to reveal new information to me. Instead, he just said the following in several different ways. Elizabeth Warren is rich and corrupt, and the CFPB is anti-American. That's it. He didn't have any argument, no facts, no stats, nothing to back that up. I looked into it, and I had to say to the guy, look, man, I think you've been lied to. This is a trades guy, a union guy, the exact target of the CFPB's protections. The red herring fallacy is a fallacy that involves diverting attention from the original issue by focusing on a superficially related, but ultimately completely irrelevant topic. The red herring fallacy is what my friend was using, and this fallacy crops up all the time in politics. One side of an argument either can't properly articulate their point, or they know that they have no point as it relates to the other side's objections, so they have a need to mask their intentions with rhetoric and fluff in order to appeal to the feelings of the public. In this particular case, 2 points. One, that Elizabeth Warren is rich, and a second, that protecting consumers is un-American, have nothing to do with the facts of the matter. If this were court, my friend would have been ran out. Everybody would have laughed at the case he was making. But this case is especially egregious because those statements are not statements of facts, nor even something that could be argued with facts. They're opinions at best. In February of 2024, right-leaning media outlets started saying that Warren was out of touch because she was worth $73 million. It seems like the seeds were being sown early on in the Trump campaign to discredit those that the movement didn't like. When Representative Derek Van Orden, who's a Republican from Wisconsin, initially came out with this number, it was widely refuted. He presented no evidence of her net worth. Credible projections of her net worth made by multiple media outlets and research firms estimated her net worth to be between $7 and $12 million. Her tax filings are public, and they paint a very different picture of her income than what was portrayed by Van Orden. Most of her family's income was from IRA and other retirement distributions relating to her husband's work in the legal field. Her salary as a senator is $174,000. So in this case, the red herring wasn't even true. It is true that $7 million is a lot, and I'd love to have that much, but it's a far cry from the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and billions of dollars that others in Congress have. The Trump administration itself has over 12 billionaires in it. That's over a dozen people running this country that weren't elected that are billionaires. They've likely never bought their own food. They certainly never worked in a coal mine. They never fixed cars or trains. They never fixed HVAC systems. They've never welded a thing in their life. But when rich people start accusing other rich people of being too rich, you know it's time to take cover from the horse shit that's falling from the sky. Now, what are we supposed to do with the argument that the CFPB is un-American? Again, this is just designed to shut down debate on the topic by appealing to a sense of herd mentality. These sorts of talking points, and I use the term talking points very loosely, are implanted in people's minds through repetition by a media machine that exists to serve a very specific purpose. My friend had fallen for a trap. But if we are operating under the premise that the Trump administration is acting with clear intentions, let's look at why they might have used this tactic to sow doubt about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that Warren helped create. In order to do that, let's look at what the CFPB actually does, and let's ignore the rhetoric. It was formed after the banks almost caused a Great Depression in 2008. It exists to protect your money from predatory banks and scam companies. It protects consumers against junk fees associated with credit cards and bank accounts. And since 2011, it has returned over $20 billion to consumers who suffered from corporate fraud. Over 200 million Americans are eligible to receive financial relief due to the CFPB's work. It's estimated that consumers will save over $6 billion every year because of the CFPB's rules regarding bank fees. Lauren Saunders, who is the Associate Director of the National Consumer Law Center, summed it up best. She said it this way. She said, quote, "It has completely changed the consumer financial marketplace. Overall, it has had a tremendous impact on making it more fair and transparent," end quote. The CFPB is one of the most efficient agencies in government. This is because it has returned $4 billion to the taxpayer for every dollar spent on the agency. And the CFPB's budget is not even part of congressional appropriations. The agency is funded by interest payments earned on securities and fees for service rendered by the Federal Reserve. So essentially, the model is that due to bad behavior, corporations who broke laws and scammed Americans fund the CFPB through fees they have to pay to do business. It's like having insurance on your car, but you can think of it as insurance for businesses who have a history of shady practices towards consumers. And this is a sad joke, but what's more American than insurance? But none of those facts matter to the media machine. In actuality, these facts are a problem, which is why they distract from them. Remember, the financial services industry is the largest donor to federal campaigns and political parties. And how many advertisements do you hear on commercial talk radio, on commercial news channels for financial products? Like, listen to talk radio, that's almost all it is. They have an interest in protecting their money pipeline at all costs. The fact that this agency was even created at all means it's a relic from a completely different time, even if that different time was only 14 years ago. And it shows how dire the situation was after the Great Recession and how much it was nearly exclusively caused by shady banking. These sorts of protections seem to be what the Trump administration is talking about when they rail against an agency as being corrupt. To the billionaire class, preventing someone from making money, even if it means outright stealing it in a white-collar way instead of in a blue-collar way, is tantamount to treason. Regulations that are a burden to companies because they just can't stop scamming people are repackaged and sold to consumers as a burden to them as well. Anything that's bad for the corporation also has to be bad for everyone else, and it's anti-American to think otherwise. The CFPB was set up to be an independent bureau within the Federal Reserve. The director is still appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, but is funded by the Fed. Oversight, comes from the fact that the Financial Stability Oversight Council, also known as FSOC, another acronym. Anyway, FSOC can overturn CFPB rules. The FSOC was created by the same congressional act that created the CFPB, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which was designed to prevent another financial crisis like the one that led to the Great Recession. It's important to note that FSOC is comprised of the Treasury Secretary and the heads of various financial regulatory agencies. The FSOC answers to Congress and the public to whom it makes annual reports, testifies at hearings, and holds open meetings. This is a lot of detail, but it's important to know because it helps us see through false arguments and purposeful distraction. The more you know, right? Like that thing on TV. If you are Gen X, you know that thing on TV. But it's also important because these are government employees. These are the people who are doing the work that Congress said, hey, that's important that we do that work. So Elon Musk has repeatedly attacked the CFPB. The big banks have attacked the CFPB for years. They never liked it. But Musk only seems to have started caring about this recently. And then Doge went into the agency and gutted it. They cut the staff by 90% after the court said, hey, you can't close this down. This is a congressionally mandated agency with a congressionally mandated mission. You can't just close it. Only Congress can do that. So they neutered it instead. They cut the staff down to almost nothing and put a person in charge who wants to actively undermine it. They did the same thing in the 80s with the EPA. I mean, it's a long story. It's a story as old as people who hate protecting the American people. Anyway, all this is probably illegal, but it doesn't matter because Donald Trump is famous for creating legal delays. And now, if a bank charges you an extra fee, or if one of your accounts gets hacked, or if money disappears from your bank account, there is no one there to help you. But let's say as a person, you don't feel that the government should be doing things like running the CFPB to protect consumers. That's fine. That's a debate we can have. But this is not really about that. It's not even really about the members of the new Don Jr. private club getting special access to the president. It's about the checks and balances of government. Congress set up the CFPB. They set up its funding structure. They set up its governance structure. And Congress said at some point, hey, these are important things we should be doing. 535 members of the government that were elected by the people said this and funded this. Legally and constitutionally, Congress has mandated that this work be done. It is not keeping up with the spirit of the law to make the organization completely ineffectual. As I talked about in the last episode, Congress is once again trying to play dumb, and they're trying to have plausible deniability. The same as with the cuts to social programs they're making. If a vast majority of Americans agree with cutting protections for American consumers, fine, Congress can repeal that law and then answer to them. But what they are doing now is the same thing they are doing with so many other things. They want to hide their intentions behind something else. And in most cases with the Trump administration, that something else is about cutting fraud, waste, and abuse. But we already showed that the CFPB gets back far more money for consumers than it costs to run the agency. And we can legitimately say that this fraud reason is invalid, unless you have a different definition of fraud, of course. And to some people, specifically rich ones, it seems that fraud is anything that stops them from doing something they want. Gavin Kleiger, he was the 25-year-old Doge staffer who helped fire 1,400 CFPB staff members. Technically, according to emails, he, quote, managed the firings. Government employees are subject to all sorts of conflict of interest and other ethics laws and policies. Again, more policies and procedures. Every year, we take courses on what you can and can't do, what stocks you can and can't own, what outside business you can and can't do based on your role in government. Gavin Kleiger, though, owns $365,000 worth of stock and crypto that are on the banned holding lists for CFPB employees. Never mind how a 25-year-old got hundreds of thousands of dollars. Government employees are not allowed to work on matters that will affect their own financial interests. Furthermore, CFPB employees are required to divest from companies that could or that are subject to agency oversight, or that are subject to enforcement actions. Most all federal employees undergo background checks, which include credit reports. Many positions require additional reporting and disclosure of financial positions. But that didn't matter to Doge because Kleiger did not divest from crypto and stock holdings that were banned for employees, which amount, again, to over $300,000. And why Musk? Well, Musk hates regulations as well. After all, he's a billionaire. It doesn't matter if it's Tesla, SpaceX, Twitter, Neuralink, whatever the company, he has something to say about people looking out for the public's best interest, especially after he does something that's incredibly fucking stupid. But specifically, in regards to the CFPB, he is looking to get into the crypto game in a bigger way than just creating a meme coin pump and dump. You know, it's kind of like he's been there, done that. Even Donald Trump is in on that game. He wants to associate crypto and payment systems with his social media, and there are questions about how this works with Visa. I'll be honest, I don't know too much about it. It's called X Money. There's a website for it. I'm not sure if it's launched in the US or how successful it is. Anyway, the CFPB would have oversight over this. So he has an interest. In fact, on the day Donald Trump took office, Musk and his companies were facing at least 65 actions or potential actions by 11 different federal agencies for violating regulations and laws. Now, many of those threats are gone, and it is looking like Musk will avoid over $2 billion in fines and punishments for his company's actions. Going through the whole list would take an entire episode, but here are 3 highlights. 1. Trump fired the Inspector General. Inspector Generals are an agency's watchdog on matters of fraud, waste, and abuse, and he fired most of them upon taking office. Anyway, he fired the Inspector General for the Department of Defense, who was investigating concerns that SpaceX repeatedly failed to comply with federal reporting protocols put in place to protect state secrets. According to the investigation, Musk refused to provide some details of his meetings with foreign leaders. The Air Force had previously denied Musk a high-level security clearance because of these security risks. 2. The USDA Inspector General launched a probe in 2022 into Elon Musk's Neuralink company. That's his company that has been trying to bring brain implants to market. The investigation centered around Neuralink's violations of the Animal Welfare Act. When Trump took office, the investigation was ongoing, but Trump fired the 22-year veteran of the agency, and she was escorted out of the office by security guards. 3. The Department of Transportation and the FAA had several open investigations into Musk's SpaceX. Previously, SpaceX had been fined $630,000 stemming from damages caused by a Starship explosion. This explosion was neither the first nor the last, and a separate SpaceX explosion was under investigation by the Department of the Interior for damaging public land and the habitat of threatened species. Trump fired the Department of Transportation Inspector General, and the FAA had resigned on Inauguration Day following pressure from Musk. The Department of Interior Inspector General was also fired. But more than that, Musk is doing the work that Congress can't do. The Congress people who are bought by the financial industry also have to answer to voters. They are stuck between a rock and a hard place. On this and so many other issues, the goals of their backers are in direct opposition to the interests of their constituents. Remember that plausible deniability that I talked about in regards to the cuts of social programs. Repealing consumer protections would be a political disaster, so having some plausible deniability is in their interests. The current Congress is not going to do anything to stop Musk and Trump from looking out for rich people. Always keep in mind, the donors who sound like whimpers will never be heard over the donors who sound like air raid sirens. That does it for today. I'm fully aware that I need to get more into how all these agencies came to be. One thing you'll hear over and over from those who are targets of investigations from, say, the CFPB or the FAA is they like to say, "I'm being targeted." And it's like, yeah, you're being targeted because there are questions about the legality or safety of your actions. But these folks like to couch it in a way that makes them seem like the victim because the deep state is out to get them. It's entirely possible that the people have had so little accountability in their lives that they really believe this. Well, you'll find, as we look into this further, for the most part, these agencies were set up with bipartisan support to solve problems that existed that no one in the private sector is going to fix. Anyway, but we can't get into that right now because we keep creating loose ends. Next time on the podcast, the steady grinding away at the protections that workers have, both inside and outside the government. We'll expand on what we talked about here and bring it specifically around to workers' rights and what it means when government employees are treated a certain way, like what it means for other employees outside the government, and how the government helps set labor standards for the rest of the market. And that's where these moneyed interests that we've been talking about also come into play. So feel free to reach out. I look forward to hearing from you. I do need help with socials and stuff like that. The email address is dogeuncovered@protonmail.com.